both live.
Hello, good afternoon. This is a special edition of Jon Stasevich's campaign, and I'm here, Kiko. I'm in person with John in Michigan here, and we're going to have a special talk today, conversation, and we highly suggest people engage in the audience. So if people are watching us live, if you have any questions for us, especially for John, because he's the one that's running for office, we highly prefer that you all give your thoughts, your comments, your questions, anything else you have. But everyone knows who John is. He's running for president of the United States 2024 as an independent candidate. And my name is Kiko. And I run a channel called Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum on YouTube and podcasting outlets. And you can also find John on previous episodes there. He's been done 3 episodes for us. And I decided to come on this campaign with John and just have a discussion with the system in the area. And so I think this will be a great way for us to engage with the audience and the people of the United States.
So where do you think we should start today?
I have quite a few questions for you, John, and hopefully the audience does too. But the first thing I thought about was you running as an independent. Let's start there. You're running as an independent for the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about this last night about Ross Perot, and this is not to make it a comparison with you and Ross Perot and other successful candidates like Jesse Ventura, but I thought about when are we going to get a candidate like that sort of explodes on the scene, and what were the parameters in place that allowed those people to become so visible all of a sudden? Have you thought about that? And as far as your campaign, how you can maybe take it to the next level?
Well, Ross, of course, he came in with a lot of wealth. He had, his experience with EDS and so he had credibility right off the bat, because especially when he was running large enterprises that were successful, and those leaders, they were very credible with the public. I think that's what got him to the level he rose to. I think he got about 20% of the vote, if I remember
Yeah,
correctly.
18.9%.
18.9, yeah, so close to 20. So that was definitely historic for an independent candidate. On the other hand, I'm coming into it as a working class person. So I don't have the wealth. I don't have that background. I've worked my entire life. I've worked in a number of industries. I started in the automotive industry, and I was in production. Before that, I did all of the kids' jobs. I worked in gas stations back then. We used to actually pump gas for people, check the oil. I've delivered pizza. I've done a lot of different things in my life. But I went finally into the automotive industry because I grew up in Detroit and that surrounding area. And so I'd worked for Ford and GM. I never did work for Chrysler directly. Got into manufacturing and manufacturing management. And then from then, I went back to school and took digital electronics. My original degree was in automotive technology. So when I first got out of college, I couldn't get a job in the labs, like dynamometer labs, doing what I was trained to do. And so I ended up in production. But as I went through working as a mechanic, and I got to know more and more about the electrical components in a car, and I found that kind of fascinating. Troubleshooting was interesting. So I went back to school and I got a degree in digital electronics, and I went to work for Digital Equipment Corporation, which was a second largest computer company at the time. At that time, back in the 80s, mainframes ran the world, and they still did all the way until into close to 2000 when they started coming out with client server. So Digital Equipment's claim to fame was the mini computer. So they basically downsized from a mainframe to a mini computer. And all of a sudden they start putting computers in engineering departments. And so other people were starting to use computers. And of course, since then, everything has continued to downsize. Digital Equipment Corporation, when the PCs came out, basically you were getting the power of a mini computer and PC.
Mm-hmm.
So they ended up being purchased by Compaq, and then Compaq and HP. I think HP bought Compaq then. So after that, the whole computer industry shifted, of course, with Apple, moving it down to getting the power of a computer and a phone. And of course, the world's changed since then. Well, when my daughter was starting her career as a speech pathologist and audiologist in the school system that she's connected with, I decided that I would help her with her grandkids, with my grandkids. And so I was watching the kids several days a week. So I kind of took an early retirement to get her started. And I had been in sales. I transitioned from an engineer to sales in the computer industry, and I was selling professional services and software services. And then, so after watching her kids, I decided to start a completely different career, and I went back to school and got a nursing degree. I went to work at University of Michigan Hospital as a registered nurse, and I worked on the neurology unit. We had a comprehensive stroke unit. We had seizure patients, anyone with a central nervous system disorder. That's where I really got interested in human health. I've always, because I had kids, been interested in human psychology. So I've been studying human psychology since I was about 32. I've been on my own, just learning, because to me, it was always a real curiosity, human behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And you live in this world and you look at what people do, and you have to be amazed, and you have to say, well, why did they do that? What made that person, whatever they did. So I've always been interested in that. So I went into nursing. So I've got a really broad background. But yeah, coming at it as a working class person and then running for high political office is completely different than what Ross Perot did. But then again, the times are different. I think the country was much more united when Ross ran. There was some division, but nothing like what we see today. Today, we see a lot of, the two parties have got us almost completely divided. It's almost as if, you were in a rowing shell with half of the population sitting in one side and facing one direction, rowing like crazy, and the other half facing exactly the opposite way, rowing as hard as they can. Everybody thinking they're going to achieve their goal, but they're not going anywhere fast. So the boat is just sitting there. If anything, the shell will split apart and we'll all sink together. So we're very divided in that way. And what's more disturbing about today is that people are actually pointing the finger at one another and blaming each other for the difficulties they see in life, instead of the people that actually have the money, the resources, and the power to actually impact what happens in our society. So I decided that now was the right time for a working class independent to run for the presidency, and that's what prompted me to get involved. I've got 5 grandchildren, and I've got 2 children. And so I'm really concerned about their future. I know that the world is changing a lot economically. We were always the empire. We have about 4% of the world's population. But back when I was a child, we were consuming 70% of the world's output. So that wasn't something that was going to be sustainable. So as the world's developed, things have changed, and now we've got real competition in China in terms of manufacturing. We have BRICS, and these BRICS nations have got dozens of other countries that are joining. So financially and economically, everything for the Americans is going to change here in the short term and in the long term. The policies that we have are designed around global conflict, frankly. We have the military-industrial complex that has gotten to the point where we're expending just too much of our resources on it. And we're not getting anything in return economically. In fact, the middle class has been shrinking as the military-industrial complex grew. And the industrial base of America, what we used to produce, all those other things other than the military weapons, is pretty much moved overseas. So we've got some real challenges, and the changes are not going to come out of the two parties that profit off the system. So I felt the timing was right, and I think I've got the right background to understand what it really takes to, develop our children so they could have a healthy, happy, productive future. And we're all interdependent, and this division has got to stop. Otherwise, we're not going to prosper, let alone thrive. So
I had questions about that. That's a part that I'm sort of struggling with. Is I don't see the division the same way, maybe because 19% nationally is a pretty chunk of the population. And to just think that that populace just disintegrated into like the duopoly, or they just got out of the system completely. There seems to be more than factors than just division. Do you think it's simply division that caused that to happen? Because that tells me that there's a base, because based on all the statistics, they're more independent voters than anybody. So you would think that the independent candidate would have more traction because the largest voting bloc is independent. So that's what confuses me about the division aspect of it. Are people really as divided as the media wants it to seem? Because when I talk to people, there's divisions, but at the same time, they agree that there's something wrong with this system. So why wouldn't those people just support something that's outside of that system? I guess would be my question to that.
Well, I mean, I think the independents did grow, but I think it's because I think people probably started based on their family background, being on one side of the aisle or another. My family, being brought up in a industrial city like Detroit, where you have a large union base,
Mm-hmm.
so we were deeply democratic. Um, and we viewed the Republican Party as the party of business, right? And of course, over the years, we've, people who were, traditionally Democrats watched the Democratic Party shift more and more to follow the same path as the Republican Party in terms of going out to get big donors. And so they got disenfranchised. And so they then start redefining themselves as independent. And so some of them would say, I'm voting for the man, not the party. Right. But when you look at it, I mean, both parties go to the same funders, which are the multinational corporations and the ownership class. So it's surprising to me when people think that by shifting and voting for a Republican versus voting for a Democrat, that somehow their interests are going to be considered.
Mm-hmm.
When both parties are funded by the same special interest, wouldn't you expect that they would both be working for those special interests that fund them?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm always surprised when people think that somehow they're going to vote for a major party candidate and get a person that's outside of the system. That is the system.
Mm-hmm.
And most people will say it. They'll say, of course, we only have two choices.
Yes.
We need to change that. We actually need more than two choices.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important that we get, instead of professional politicians, we need some working class people who've actually raised families, know what it's like to live and work for a living, and what our families have to go through, what we need in order to achieve success. I think we need people like that in politics. So I created something called the Ballot Access Coalition. And the Ballot Access Coalition is a group of people who are completely independent, and they're all volunteers. And the job of the coalition is to balance and level the playing field to help get independents and third-party candidates on the ballot to compete against these two parties, which have a monopoly on political office and representation. So this coalition of individuals, we have state coordinators and regional coordinators and national coordinators, but what their job is to do is help others get on the ballot, so that when we have Republicans or Democrats who are serving their own interests or the interests of their funders instead of the people in their community, we've got somebody else on the ballot, a third choice.
Mm-hmm.
So it isn't good enough just for, to take the presidency. Although I think the top offices would be something that would be beneficial for working class people, and having someone there that actually represents us. I think it's really important from the very top of the ticket all the way to the local communities that the people own their government rather than the ownership class that does now.
There's some more questions I have. I was going to touch on the Ballot Access Coalition because I do follow the minor parties and the independent party movements and the candidates associated with those two. But I was curious about this whole idea of the press release, because you and one other person that's running for the president of the United States outside of the D and the R had press releases. I think yourself, and there's a person running. Her name is Barbara Stone. She's running under the People's Party banner, but I don't think it's the movement of a People's Party. It's like a party called the People's Party that I don't know if she created it or not, but you two are the only ones that have like press releases showing that you launched a campaign for president. And I'm wondering how can you get beyond that and get more traction? Kind of going to my original question, as far as sort of reaching out to like the Joe Rogans and sort of breaking into that those types of channels of communication.
Well, there are quite a few independents. If you go look at the FEC, you check with the FEC and you look at how many candidates, there are quite a few independents that are trying to run for president. Of course, they're all underfunded. They don't necessarily have the teams put together. But I think as we get closer and closer to the election, we're still quite a ways off. You're going to see some of them finding that they're not getting traction. So I've already had a couple of them that have come to me and said, look, my campaign's not getting traction. Maybe we'd be better off working together. So I see that there's going to be some consolidation there. So, so the Ballot Access Coalition is another tool. We get the multiplier effect. So they started out, of course, working to get me on the ballot. I mean, I designed it initially. It was called the Ballot Access Initiative to get me on the ballot, right? And but I wanted it to go independent. I wanted to last way beyond my campaign. So now that it's more opened up, that brings other people in so we can build a coalition. So I would think that a lot of third parties would be interested in this as well, because it's not just for independent candidates. The coalition, the Ballot Access Coalition, is to help third party candidates get on as well. They haven't been successful in past elections, so we do have a lot of things that we have in common. And of course, it will be up to them to present their case to this group, right? And to see if they want to help them get on the ballot. They are going to have to sell themselves. In the future, I could see the Ballot Access Coalition going possibly as a nonprofit, right? And actually providing more than just ballot access. They could provide support in terms of services to help design and build networks for these candidates and help give them a leg up so that they can actually compete more effectively. But I mean, certainly, I think most Americans, if they really think about it, they know that the way the system is structured now, that these two parties are hardly distinguishable in anything other than rhetoric at a policy level. They all agree on a lot of things. They agree on the perpetual wars because we see they fund them to the tune of 850 million. They obviously agree on the debt. They're telling me now that the debt is going to be close to what the military, the defense budget is. So can you imagine we're going to be spending $850 million just on the interest on the debt? That's going to really wipe out services for the American people, government services that are sorely needed. And they obviously agree on the privatized healthcare system that denies about 30 million people access. So you got 30 million people, Americans, that have no health coverage whatsoever. And then probably more than that have the health coverage, but are afraid to use it because they don't feel that they can afford the co-pays and all the other things that go along with it. So how would you expect to have a healthy, productive society if you can't even get your basic health needs met? And then we see all of the other symptoms that neither party seems to be able to fix. Homelessness is on the rise. We have a financial system where banks are collapsing. There runs on the bank. It's a real scary time for a lot of Americans. So we'll see what happens as we start coming together and building a coalition of independents and third parties. That's my hope, is that we'll be able to compete and long beyond my campaign.
That you mentioned the Ballot Access Coalition, and I follow a lot of these different voting methods. I mean, you've mentioned in the first interview, which I knew about a little bit, the star voting method, and ranked choice voting is another one that's always mentioned to sort of be an equalizer, I guess, to help independent and minor party candidates get on the ballots and stuff. there are lots of organizations that are, I think, that have similar goals to yours. Have you ever thought about in the future maybe collaborating with those organizations to sort of build your forces together and to help with ballot access?
Yeah, I've got a couple of people in my campaign now who have brought that up, that very issue. I don't have anyone currently that's focused on that, but there certainly is a need. So there are a lot of organizations out there who are doing grassroots things at a local level. We do need to contact them and try to bring them in and find places where we can work together. So that is a goal. I'd like to find somebody. If there's anyone out there like that, give us a call. We'll put you to work.
Hey, John.
That's good.
Yeah.
There's somebody that asked a question already. Did you want to hear it?
Okay. Sure.
Okay, so when are we going to nationalize the railroads after what happened in East Palestine?
That's a good question. Who's that coming from?
It's coming from, it looks like an anonymous account.
Okay.
So, no name associated.
Well, obviously, we've had a couple of railroad accidents lately, the East Palestine one being the most recent and most memorable because of the damage and destruction to that community. I think there are a lot of things that have to be nationalized, including the railroad. These private systems, I guess it relates to capitalism when you talk about, privatization. And the way I look at the economic system altogether, capitalism itself is, to me, definitely unstable. It's inefficient, it's ineffective, certainly unjust in my mind. We see the enormous wealth gap, and I think it's unsustainable. There are some fundamental services that I think need to be nationalized, like transportation, the railroad being a part of the transportation system. I think the banking system should be nationalized. I think we should own our own money. Currently, we depend on private sources. The Federal Reserve is a private organization, and they've been lending the nation money that we have to pay back with interest. Well, they print the money for us, and they purchase our bonds, and then the bonds go up for sale, and then those people that purchase those bonds, we have to pay the interest. But the main point is that we don't actually own our monetary system. Somebody else does. And so I think we need to own our monetary system as well. But certainly I do agree that we have to nationalize the transportation system, and railroads would be a big part of that. And in fact, we have to go a lot further. We have to modernize those railroads more in a way that China has. They've been building high-speed rail that are much more efficient at a very rapid rate. They've connected most of their big cities. So railroads just part of the infrastructure that we need to update.
I actually had a couple of questions about economy. You mentioned debt earlier, and this may tie into the question about the railroad system, because we know that was a terrible outcome, especially with the party that's supposedly a pro-union party, which we know. I mean, you've explained already how that's not even the situation. But what's your view on debt jubilee? Because I know you follow economists like Michael Hudson, and I'm not sure exactly what Richard Wolff's positions are on this, but I interviewed Jack Rasmus a few weeks ago, and he doesn't seem to think that there are parameters in place, or at least there's not enough implementation of something that's viable for a debt jubilee to work. So, and Michael Hudson seems to be way more optimistic about it. What do you feel about the idea of a debt jubilee, just especially alleviating student debt and maybe medical debt?
Well, I mean, historically, I think I think Jubilee came out of the religious community back in the early ages, even before Christ, when a new king came into power and people were so indebted. One of the ways for him to get the people on his side was to forgive all debt, clean a slate, so to speak. Capitalism concentrates wealth. It's done it in every society where it's ever been practiced, which is essentially everywhere in the world. And that's why you see this enormous wealth gap. The wealth gap today is so extreme. You'd have to go back to the time of the pharaohs to see this kind of wealth gap. So when it gets to the point where the workers can't afford the products, that's a real problem. And that's the purpose of the Jubilee, to forgive debt so that people can get back up, and so that we can, get product moving and produce product and sell product. I think that in this next recession that we're going into with the inflation, the recession, I was watching a report about General Motors. I guess the average cost of their new electric vehicles is going to be in the $50,000 range. I think 54,000 is what they said. Well, that's the United States' largest manufacturer. How many people today, and going into a recession where we're going to have massive layoffs, are going to be able to afford to purchase those vehicles? So at a practical level, we may have to find a way to wipe out the debts that we have. Corporations, families, both have all-time high debt. Our nation has got, what, about 32 billion in debt? You'd have to divide that out between the 332 million people that is our population, according to the last census. And you're talking like 99,000 per every man, woman, and child. We don't have the ability to pay that back. And the interest on it is going to kill all of the social services that the government provides to our people. And even it could get to the point, if we have another big round of inflation, with that kind of debt, and with the dollar no longer being part of the world's reserve currency, the value declines in debt because of that. Like once the BRICS nations come together, led by China, and they provide the world with another means of exchanging, like oil. We used to have the petrodollar, but now you've got Saudi Arabia allying with China and with Iran and with Russia. So they're getting around the dollar. That's really going to lower the value of the dollar. So we're going to have huge inflation. And so it's going to be very difficult for our working class families to afford these foreign goods that are being produced when the costs are going to be so much higher. So I'm not sure what the answer is in regards to these two major parties. I think we may have to move beyond capitalism as we know it. I would propose something like Professor Richard Wolff does, which is essentially changing the ownership model. Currently, we have concentrated wealth in the hands of the ownership class. A very tiny group of people, maybe 6 to 8 individuals, own the controlling interest of every major industry in the United States. Now, if we had a model where, let's say, the workers themselves that worked in an enterprise, they were the owners of those enterprises. So it would be one worker, one share of stock, and one vote. So they would elect the board of directors. They would be the ones holding that board accountable. So currently, in the system that we have now, the owners have the controlling interest. They put the board in that's going to return profit to them. Imagine if the owners worked those enterprises and they decided how that profit was going to be split up. I doubt that they would give the CEO $50 million a year while their average workers are barely getting by. They also wouldn't pollute their own communities. So I think we have to, not just from an economic perspective, from an environmental perspective as well, think about how we can move beyond capitalism. I'd like our government to be more transparent. That's why I think that people need to own the president. He's got the bully pulpit, and he can bring all of us together and engage people, bring them into the discussion about all the options. We've got a lot of brilliant people, and we have to figure out how we're going to solve some of these problems, and we have to discuss it openly. So there's not just one way. There's probably going to be half a dozen different ways that we could solve some of these problems, but we need to openly and transparently discuss it, and then look at the options, present them back to the American people, and let them choose which way we go moving forward. But it's clear that capitalism, the way we practice it now, simply isn't working. And yet both parties completely support it and want no change whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but that's to be expected because they're really the epitome of the system that projects itself more and more each day into saving itself at the expense of the rest of the citizens or that support the system. Unfortunately, we're the backbone of that system, the worker. Comparing that model that you've already alluded to several times, giving power back to the workers. But the workers are constantly the ones that are keeping this system afloat because that's where the productivity is coming from.
Right. Well, you and I expect that. I mean, I find it very interesting that so many people will vote for a member of one of these two parties, thinking that somehow this is an outsider. No, if they're a member of a major party, they are a part of that system. When you vote for a member of either major party, you're voting to maintain the system the way it is. These people are not interested in change. They're not interested in progress. And it's obvious they're not interested in progress for working class families. So it's surprising to me that people continue to fall for that narrative.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard people say that, well, the capitalists, they deserve the high income because they're the job providers, they're the creators, you know what I mean? And they're the ones that took the risk. That's not my perspective. In my perspective, it's the workers taking the risk. They know they're going to get their reward.
Mm-hmm.
They are the house. It's like going to Vegas and thinking that somehow as a person participating and not owning it, that you're going to win. You might be that 1 in a million, but essentially the ones that always win are the owners.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way it is in our system, the way it exists now. So the ones taking a real risk are the workers. They don't know whether they're going to have a job tomorrow or whether they're going to be laid off. They have no control over that. The people that own those industries and select the boards, those boards are going to serve them, not the people that work there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my view.
Yeah, we had a pretty extensive talk about this on episode 18 of Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum about this whole idea of the worker and sort of I guess in a way we need to get back to a way to get the workers controlling the means of productions. But that sounds to me like something that's reasonable. That sounds like a language that could penetrate to a lot more people if you said it that way, because we've talked about previously how terminologies have been a way to sort of detract people from following things that may be in their best interest. Would you suggest something like that? Would that make more sense to everyday people if you said something like that? We have to sort of take the means back in our hands.
Well,
would that connect more with people, you think?
Well, I think it should.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether it will or whether it won't. I mean, that's what I'm proposing. I think that if you don't own it, you're not going to be as responsible for it. The reality, when I worked on the assembly line at Ford Motor Company as an example, whenever there was a change to improve the process, it didn't normally come from the engineering staff or it didn't come from the owners. It came from people that worked on the line. And I had workers that would come to me and say, hey, you know what, if we could do it this way, it'd be much more effective. And then we'd call the time study guys in. They would look at it, study it, and more often than not, it was right. So we had a suggestion box. So the people were really running it. They always have been. Not only were they producing, they were coming up with new ideas to make it more efficient and more effective. But I think when you're an owner, you're going to be more responsible. So the workers themselves, as they start operating as owners, they're going to be much more directed at solutions. They're going to think in terms of that company as being a part of something that's them, that they have a stake in, and they're going to want to make it work to the best of their ability. And that's going to lead to more cooperation and more collaboration. And that's the way we really get things done, is working together. Right now in the competitive environment, there's a lot of tension. People work against each other. You see even in the offices where people are kind of working against each other to get the boss's attention so I can get a higher raise than the guy that sits in the desk next to me, you know? And so there's this tension built into the system, and really going right down to the very basic level. If you think about capitalism as the exchange of goods, they would say between two people. I would say there's always seems to be a power differential between the people, you know, so it isn't two equal people. But even if it were, they're both, one of the people is wanting to purchase a product or a service, and he wants to purchase it at the cheapest cost. In other words, to serve himself, his self-interest. On the other side of that equation, someone's wanting to sell it. They want to maximize profit. That's, again, self-serving. Okay. And there's that automatic tension. So right at the very basic level, it's kind of antisocial, I would say. What we really want to do is what we did as kids. I don't know, when I was a kid, I remember we'd all get together and let's say we decided we want to build a tree house. Some kids would go out and grab some lumber and some sticks, and we'd all work together, right? You work together, and it was fun. It was fun to work together, and that's the way life really should be. And we do much better by working together than by ourselves, and that's true across sports. So we need to learn how to work cooperatively and collaboratively, not just in our own enterprises, in our own families, in our own communities, and across the world, because we're not an island even. You know, I know a lot of people say America first. Well, I do believe that we need to take care of our families and our children, our communities, but not at the expense of our neighbors. We have to work with them as well. If you have a neighbor that's failing, that's not going to be good for your family, right? So, you know, their house gets neglected. They don't cut the lawn because they can't afford the gas, whatever. If they're dysfunctional, out of work, the neighborhood starts to deteriorate. When we're all working together, supporting each other, and we're working in common interest, which is the health and well-being of our children, our families, our communities, our nations, and really all of humanity. When our economic system drives that, I think we're going to have a much healthier, happier world.
I had a question about, we've been talking about economy some, and I sort of want to stick to that because I asked a question about debt jubilee. I'm curious about your views about the gold standard, because I think it was Nixon that took us off the gold standard, if I'm not wrong. I may be wrong on that, but I believe it was Nixon that sort of signed the last the remnants of that away. Do you have a propensity to consider that again, like maybe tying our currency to something like gold? Because you mentioned earlier, you talked about fiat currency, and if we just basically print the money off over and over again, I mean, clearly that's just going to create more issues. I mean, not just inflation, but I don't know, just everything that's standard of living. It affects everything we do, basically.
Right.
We can't even pay the money that we owe now back.
Well, it's a cause of inflation because when you flood the market with money, then you've got the same number of goods. Unless you've somehow increased production, you got much more money going after a finite group of goods, and so then people start bidding up the price, and that's where the inflation comes from, right? And now, in terms of where do we go to move beyond that, I've got some ideas about it. I think maybe a basket of commodities, maybe a basket of currencies. There's a lot of different talk about it. I think the most important thing that we do is come together and bring in the experts. And let's look at the options. Like I say, there may be 4 or 5 different options. Let's evaluate each and every one critically. Let's see what kind of system we can design for the 21st century that will work at a national level, at a state level, and at a local level. That's the kind of culture we need to, move forward with. And so we're going to bring everyone in to this discussion. That's what I'd like to see. Right now, these decisions are pretty much made in think tanks. So the ownership class funds these think tanks. They actually write the legislation, hand it off to the politicians that they've already paid for through campaign finance, and then naturally they're going to do their work to pass it because that's what they've been hired to do. And that's just the opposite of open, transparent. Right? So if you really want open, transparent government, you're going to have to own it. And that's the key. So running as an independent, I don't have any special interest supporting me. I have no billionaires. I won't accept any money from any special interest that offers it. The only place I will take any money, campaign contributions from is working class people will be the minimum. But my first job, if elected, is to actually remove all special interest money from the political system. I would like to see a change to the Constitution that would mandate, amend it to mandate only publicly funded elections. Get all special interest money out. So anybody that tries to bribe a politician, hand them money. Not only would that be illegal and punishable, but if the politician takes it, he's breaking the law as well.
And as president, you have the authority to do that, to do an executive order?
Well, I could do an executive order, but that's probably not going to really last because it would go to court. It would go to court and it would be overturned. The real powers in the people. I can't do anything, but if I were to be elected president, I'd have a big enough base. I would challenge Congress to amend the Constitution and to remove this money.
You're going to challenge your political opponents to do something that you think is good for the people. You think that they're actually going to do what you say? I'm
not sure they're my opponents, actually. In some ways, I think that, a lot of people that go into political office, even the major party candidates, those congressmen, I don't think they love sitting there dialing for dollars and dropping to their knees every time a billionaire walks through the door, right? Or chasing them down. You know what I mean? I think they really want to represent the people. But the way the system is set up now, they're not going to do it. But with an independent president that's owned by the people in the White House, you have that kind of popular support. Anyone that doesn't support that agenda, we're not going to wait for midterm elections to get rid of them. I'm going to go right down and we're going to organize at a district level. Any congressman that isn't willing to amend the Constitution, get all the special interest money out of our system, that wants to maintain this corrupt system for their own benefit and for the benefit of their funders, we're going to go into their districts and we're going to work to remove them from office through recalls.
You're gonna be going to a lot of districts.
It won't be. Well, maybe, but we might be surprised. We might be surprised at how many actually do want that, but are unable to do it under this current circumstances. But if I get the kind of popular support, grassroots support, that's sending a whole different message to the ownership class. We will no longer tolerate this corruption, right? It isn't me doing any of this. The power that I derive, if elected, comes from the people themselves. They're going to do the work. They're the ones that are going to remove this. They're the ones that are going to put the pressure on these people. Right. And that's why the Ballot Access Coalition is such an important component of this, because unless you have independents and third-party candidates that you can get onto the ballot to replace them, all you're doing is flip-flopping from a Republican to a Democrat and then back again. And you're really happy with neither because they don't serve us. We don't own our government.
Yeah, I won't go too much into detail about my personal views about what you just described, but you said something and I was nodding my head. I was like, yes, that's what I'm talking about. The people. But I think my version of what the people should do is a lot different than what your version is. And that's totally fine, because you're running for the office of president of the United States. And I think that's a good, I think having cohesion within that system, because you have to work with people that may not necessarily have your views or objectives in mind. And so for you to maybe get anything done, you have to at least, be cordial in that system so that there is some sort of potential to work together, because I don't think that an opponent in that sphere is going to work with you if you're automatically coming in and you're pointing the fingers at them, like you kind of going to your premise all along. You've been consistent in saying you're not going to blame the people. And so maybe that is the most effective strategy going forward.
Well, I mean, I would expect that you would have differences with me. And in fact, everyone should. Well, in the first place, we're all conditioned differently. So we naturally, we're not in the same place at the same time. So we're going to have a different perspective on the world. But that's the beautiful part about diversity. See, the beauty of diversity is that you get a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different viewpoints. And now when you have open, transparent discussion and engagement, then you can sort out which is going to be the best and all of the options. So there isn't always a best way. So there might be 3 or 4 paths. But then what you want to do is you want to try to understand the options through this open engagement. you may disagree with me and you may disagree with the major parties. The difference is you can come to me and we're going to discuss it. Try going to the major parties and tell them you want to discuss your different.
Well, that's why I don't allow them on my platform, because I think the decision's already been made. To your point,
Yeah.
the collaborative aspect is already mute at that
Yeah.
point. And that's a big. I want to talk about something you mentioned earlier with you have end perpetual wars on your site. Like, that's a really big message you seem to be driving home. But you also mentioned the environment as well. And we talked off camera that those two go together. War and environment go together, because war is the largest pollutant of the environment. So how do we, at one end, we end the wars, but at the same time, we have to do something to keep the system afloat, because those war companies are only in existence because they have to pay their investors. They have to pay off everyone else that's invested in the Lockheeds and the Boeings and the Raytheons and everybody else. So how do we, I don't even want to say a balance, because if you say end the wars, how do we end the wars? And how do we transition away from war into something where people don't have to worry about job security, I guess, in those industries?
Well, I mean, it's going to be a transition. You can't, I can't snap my fingers and overnight do it. But, you know, our military that's currently all over the world, right? We've got 800 some plus bases, you know, we're supporting all of that. And what are we getting? We're destroying the world. We're polluting the world. We're polluting the environment. And as you know, the military, as you said, is the largest polluter, the largest, they extract all of that energy for all of those machines that they have to operate, right? Now, imagine that we do find a way to bring those people home to start working on our infrastructure. So now we can build the infrastructure and be more efficient on moving products, moving people, getting services, delivering services. Those people that are currently working in a system or in an industry that's no longer needed and wanted by society, we have to figure out a way to to move them over to something that's going to be beneficial. All right. We don't want them to suffer. We don't want their families to go without. They need income. They need to be supported. But if we no longer need military contractors building bombs that we're not going to explode, then we're going to have to put them into some productive capacity. We've got an infrastructure to build. We talked about the railroad system earlier. We should be building high-speed rails that go between every system. We're going to have autonomous vehicles. We could completely redesign the transportation system to be much more effective. We should have a subway or a train system in every city. We should have buses for local transport. I see in the future where we've got the technology to go on my iPhone, order the type of vehicle I want. It shows up at my door, helps move me and my product to wherever I need, even if it's to a high-speed rail. Jump on that high-speed rail, and in 3 hours time, I'm sitting in LA, you know. So we've got a lot of work that needs to be done. And it's just so we just need to take the workers we have now that are functioning in the military industrial complex and move them over to do things that we need in other areas. There's a lot of scientific research that has at the base of the military industrial complex. Imagine if that gets focused now on humanity. We could take some of those experts and have them looking at technologies, new clean technologies for energy, nuclear fusion for the future. Right now, we got nuclear fission technologies that would allow us to produce clean energy, and the waste from that we could reuse in a medical capacity, and there are other ways to reuse it. So even today, there's much more energy density in a nuclear fission plant, our current nuclear technology plants. And we would all benefit from that. Now, at some point in time, we want nuclear fusion, which is the way the sun operates. And we would have such an abundant amount of clean energy that we wouldn't even bother to meter it. That's how cheap it would be. You know, now, but you're still going to need those technical people who can build it, who can maintain it, and who can operate it, right? And actually, nuclear fusion would actually be safer. You wouldn't have the kind of things we have now with the older reactors where you had meltdowns, you know, threats to the environment. So we have the ability to move people from what we don't need to what we need, and we're all going to do better for it. And that's so we have to figure out that transition, which is why you need that public engagement. You need to bring everybody in. We need to bring our scientists in. We need to bring our engineers in. We need to bring workers in. There's a lot that needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
You know, think about healthcare. If we were to nationalize our healthcare system, by nationalizing our healthcare system, we would be much more efficient. We now spend twice the amount of money per capita as any nation on earth. And yet our objective healthcare outcomes, based on every study that's ever been done, list us the very lowest in the industrialized world. So we got the worst outcomes in the industrialized world, and we spend twice as much.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean in dollars and cents? It means that we're spending about 12,000 per capita, while a country like Germany or the Netherlands are spending 6,000 per capita. Take that 6,000 delta, multiply it. We got 332 million people. Multiply that times 300 million people times 10 years. That's $18 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
We would be saving. Now we take that $18 trillion, we invest it in new jobs for these people, move them over. You know, so there's plenty to be done. There's plenty of work. There's no reason for any financial insecurity for anyone. Everybody should have a good paying job, but we're going to have to change the system to get that. That's what I think our workers need to understand. We can transition safely. You shouldn't fear change. The only reason you fear change is because the kind of system we have now, whenever there's a change, it means you're out of a job and your family's at risk. That's what brings the fear of change, but it doesn't have to be that way. When we work together cooperatively and collaboratively, the government could be the employer of last resort. So if private industry cannot produce a good paying job and put you to use, the government can bring you in. We'll put you to use there. And by building our infrastructure, we're going to be much more efficient, much more effective. Everybody's going to thrive and prosper.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we want. That's the world we want. That's the world of the 21st century. We're going to turn a page on the last century, and we're going to move forward. We're going to own our government. It'll be the first time in American history that the American people actually own their president if I'm elected.
Well, you hit on something interesting there about we have a national army, Navy, Coast Guard. Isn't it nationalized? Our military is nationalized.
That is a national institution, like Social Security. Yeah,
so that shouldn't be a problem transitioning. The transition shouldn't be hard then. It's just a matter of having job availability, because in these certain industries, because the military is already nationalized.
That's right. We're already paying them.
Uh-huh.
But what we're getting for it is a lot of enemies overseas, and we're destroying the planet and different societies. We just spent over $100 billion in Ukraine. That was a needless, senseless war, absolutely unnecessary destruction. And the price economically pales compared to the human cost for the Ukrainian people. It's a complete outrage. Their geopolitical analysts like John Mearsheimer, who explains how we got into this unnecessary war, driven pretty much by U.S. policy. In other words, the policy derived from these two corporate captured political parties. And so the American people, once they understand that, and they know that when they vote for any member of a corrupted organization has to be corrupt or they'll be thrown out. You have to spin with the wheel. You get into that organization. If you don't act the way those people that drive it want you to act, you're not going to be there long. Okay? So I think it's time for the American people to, identify the problem as being the current system, the way it's designed and structured, this corporate captured political system. And it's time for us to put people that we own in office instead of people that are funded by a small group of multinational corporations, right? That's the only path forward. And that's why my campaign slogan is the new path forward.
Is that your official slogan?
That's it.
I knew, because I know I pressed you on a couple of times in the first interview about your slogan. I wanted to plug this book in for your audience. It's called Flashpoint in Ukraine: How the U.S. Drive for Hegemony Risk World War III. This was posted in 2014. It's a compilation of 25 essays, a lot of interesting geopolitical analysts, economists. I've had two people on already on my forum, and I have a third joining on Monday, Jeffrey Summers, is going to talk about sort of the economic cost and just the human life of war in general. And it kind of collaborates a lot to what you're saying and the people that you follow. And I think your audience will get a good read from that Flashpoint in Ukraine. I think it's for your audience, I think that they would love a book like that. And there's also a book that Medea Benjamin published that talks about the Ukraine war. Medea Benjamin from Cold Pink is also going to come on the forum to talk about sort of just these different angles of just being against the war, how war really doesn't solve anything. But it kind of leads to a question I had about what do you say to people who are concerned about if we pull out of Ukraine, or at least not a physical truce, but these proxy wars? What about do we become more vulnerable? Because that's going to be a question that comes up. So what happens? Do we just assume that if we de-escalate things on our end, that the world will naturally sort of gravitate to more of a peaceful space?
Well, I don't know who you interviewed. You said you interviewed a couple people already about
Jack
Ukraine
Rasmus, and I interviewed Matthew Witt.
What did he say in regarding to what he felt the threat was to the American people and the reason for us being in Ukraine? I mean, I think the general, what you hear in the mainstream media is that Putin is a threat. The Russians are
right.
What was his take on that? Does he feel that they're a threat to the American people?
No, completely not at all. No, it's more so. My question is more so to people who, if you had the premise of us, like, if we decided to not pursue those war and militaristic endeavors anymore, what would you say to people who would be afraid that would open us up to vulnerability? It doesn't even have to be Russia, but because I think that goes into the mindset that we've been so reliant on the military industrial complex. And so I think people are naturally going to be apprehensive, because this would be a new era for the United States to not be involved in wars.
Well, I believe this is a proxy war. Okay. So, the way it's spun is that we're helping the Ukrainians fight against the Russians. No, we're supplying them. We're training them. This is clearly a proxy war. It's the United States against Soviet Union. And we started 100%. With a financial attack in terms of, going into Russia and trying to isolate them economically, right? So all of the sanctions that we put on them.
Which is a form of war.
That is a form of war. That's an act of war, as far as I'm concerned. That's exactly the wrong thing to do. I mean, what we need to do is we need to engage the international community, and we need to support international law. The United States is not even a signatory to the criminal court, the International Criminal Court. They talk about holding Putin responsible. Well, if you're not a signatory to the court, how are you going to do that? No, I think Putin, if you listen to guys like John Mearsheimer, Putin went in there not because he wanted to. He tried to get us to back off.
Yeah, the encroachment of what he felt was NATO. Getting closer to the border.
Yeah, so NATO kept moving. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the agreement with Gorbachev and Reagan was that NATO wouldn't continue to march east, and that they'd have a buffer zone between the border, and that these countries in the middle would be independent. Well, what's happened, instead of living up to that commitment, NATO, led by the United States, continues to encroaching it closer.
And they got more members joining.
Right.
Which is right next to the
border. And so really we are supporting. We wanted to bring Ukraine in, and so when Biden was challenged by Putin, and Putin asked, "Do not bring Ukraine into NATO," because once you become a member of NATO, you're going to take NATO's weapons and you're going to use those, which are produced in the United States. Nice profit there. So we have a profit motive, placing our weapons on Russia's border. What would we do if that were turned around.
That's exactly what the analyst came on and said on my show. If this was Mexico and the U.S., it would. I mean, why wouldn't the U.S. think that that was a danger? I mean, so you have to understand it's not even it's pretty much common sense if you followed the conflict, which started a long time ago. It really dates back to the Soviet Union, but really in the Clinton at the end of the 90s is where you saw this kind of back and forth tension, like the NATO, even the whole idea of NATO is problematic in itself because there's no more Soviet Union, so why is there NATO? But I guess those people argue that Russia is it goes back to geopolitics again. It's like a new Cold War. It's like the continuation.
Yeah, it's a Cold War that could turn into a hot war, and we're talking about a hot war in the nuclear age with a nuclear armed nation, Russia, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at a geopolitical level, it doesn't even make any sense because by us being the aggressor at Russia and pushing them the way we did, it actually drove them closer to China. And now they've developed a tight military relationship and economic relationship with China. So our sanctions didn't work because China and other neighboring countries in Asia and elsewhere were taking purchasing the oil that Europe used to purchase. So the sanctions simply didn't work anyway. They were ineffective. So even at that level, we were wrong. And we're continuing to pour money in there. And according to Douglas McGregor, who was a colonel in the military in Iraq, he was stationed in Europe. He knows a lot of those people. And he claims that there is no way that Ukraine can win in this war. They're going to lose. And we've already spent, like I said, over 100, maybe 105 plus billion
more
dollars.
More than that now, yeah.
And we're pouring more in and we've trained them. And so what's the next step? U.S. Soldiers getting involved? I'm sure we already have them in there in the way we had them in Vietnam when that started. It was a training and support capacity, right? Advisory capacity. And it wasn't long before we were engaged in actual combat. So I can see this, and he explains this could go out of control that way. And now the U.S. is in a hot war with the Soviet Union, who's got a nuclear arsenal. That's the kind of threat that they're posing. And this could have all been avoided.
Me personally, I think that the idea of World War III is a little exaggerated personally, only because I think the U.S. is getting exactly what it wants. Ukraine, unfortunately, is ground zero of a geopolitical war, and the Ukrainian people they suffered even before we enhanced our involvement with all this extra funding, because there were two International Monetary Fund deals that kind of, they indebted the people of Ukraine even before this happened in 2014,
right?
With the previous coups that happened and all the transfers of power, and then you basically have those people's livelihood already been taken away from them. Their economy was already in a bad shape, and so I don't know. This is obviously not going to help the economy any at all.
Well, it's destroyed the economy. Well, economically, by getting in there, we're selling a lot of weapons.
And Russia too. Russia and Ukraine's relationship with each other, I don't think that's talked about enough, is how Ukrainians and a lot of Europe relies on Russia for energy and different, needs. And so, going to a war sort of hurts everyone when you talk about the European economy, and really who benefits from that pain that's happening over there. You have to sort of think to yourself. I think you have a grasp of that, but you're one of few people who are running for office or president that has this position, which is concerning, that you have a minority position amongst a whole group of people, a whole field of people. And why do you think that is, that you have such a minority position?
Well, actually Trump kind of has the same position.
He does.
Now, I don't know that I can believe him. I don't know that I could believe him, or that he'd actually follow through, because he's made promises before about, drawing down on the military and lowering the cost, so I'm not sure I believe him, but his claim at least is that he wants a negotiated settlement. He doesn't see this as something we can win. So to that extent, I agree with him. I certainly disagree with him on many, many other fronts. but at least on that, I think he's in the right position there. So I guess I'm saying I'm not the only one.
But I'm speaking not so much to Trump, because he's kind of his own entity in some ways, but I was speaking more to the people who are supposed to be anti-war, like the Green Party.
Yeah.
There's lots of anti-war, or at least supposed anti-war factions that are totally fine with supporting Ukraine in this current crisis, which is I just think that your position is a very reasonable position. I think is the correct position. But I'm asking you, I guess, running for office, are you surprised to see fellow independent and minor party candidates sort of hold that Ukrainian banner, not understanding the full context of what's going on?
Well, it's a little surprising, but then again, not completely, because it the way the party politics are fought, there's a war, there's a rhetoric war. And so no matter what one party does, the other automatically has to be against it. Because if they do the right thing, if it turns out well for the American people, they feel they're going to lose votes. So you've got the party that's in control, and then you've got the opposition party. So there's so much confrontation and conflict within our two-party system that we can't get anything done. That's why we're kind of at a standstill. Going back to what you said about you don't feel nuclear war is a threat. Clearly, we got into this because there's profit in selling military hardware in the Ukraine war, and that's what the aid is. It's actually military hardware. So we keep our people employed in that military industrial complex. But then there's also financial institutions that are already figuring out how they're going to profit off rebuilding Ukraine once it's destroyed, because it's clear it's going to be completely destroyed.
Yep.
Right. But even if the nuclear conflict, and I'm not saying it's a probability, but even if the possibility were what would we argue? 5%, 10%, 15%, now, whatever it is, to me, that's still way more than it should be. It's unnecessary. It's unnecessary. And there are a few people who actually believe a nuclear war is winnable in the military industrial. Now, I don't know. Do these people have bunkers a mile underground with generators and thermal heat that feel they can live underground for 100 years? Maybe. I don't know that. I don't understand why anyone would even consider a nuclear war that they could manage it in such a way that they can guarantee it would be limited. Right. And so things have a way of spinning out of control. Wars are, by their nature, unpredictable. So these people that think they somehow can read the future, and they know that they can engage in nuclear power and not have it spin out of control, I think right off the top, you have to question that kind of thinking. It makes no sense.
But I think it's also another, and this is just me speaking personally, I believe it could be another distraction, because you have to keep in mind the people who are using these words, talking about nuclear war, and maybe the war is already in the air and we don't know it. Maybe the war has already happened or is going on within us right now, and we're talking about this when other stuff is going on. I mean, we see this financial situation happening, with the recession growing even more in this time. But I did want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. You talked about the nationalization aspect of the railroad system. You seem to be for a rail system across the country. That would be efficient. You could go down to Atlanta, you're in Nashville, you could go from Detroit to Chicago, and you wouldn't have to worry about driving cars and stuff. But I do wonder, is that too much going on if you propose a national rail system? But on the other hand, you talk about AI a lot. Would there be a conflict of interest between this whole growing presence of AI, the national rail system, and then you talk about electronic cars as well? Isn't that just too much going on? Wouldn't something have to give? You have electric cars, the rail system, and that.
Well,
how would those three coexist?
Well, so as part of a whole system. So today the transportation system comprises of a few buses that run in a few different places, private cars. I've got a couple cars sitting in my garage. I only use, I don't know, maybe 5% of the time. Most of the time they're just sitting. There's a very inefficient use of product, right? So we put all those resources, all that labor, all of that money into these products, and they're being used 5% of the time. What business could sustain that? That's an inefficient model. for a transportation system. And so it's not just me. People all over the country, their cars are just sitting most of the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So an efficient transportation system, what you build, you're going to use, and you're going to use it a lot. So that's how you get the efficiency, and you bring your costs down, and you get so much more bang for your buck. So we have to go that way. Now, none of this is going to happen overnight. It's a process, but you have to start on that road. As far as the technology goes, we're not going to put the genie back in the bottle. We're marching forward. Now, you have to march forward with technology with caution, which is another reason that public ownership, having the workers in control, they're going to be more cautious when they release product into the market.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be, I need to release it because I need to make a profit right now, and then find out later that it was harmful to their neighbors and their community in some way,
Mm-hmm.
and then apologize and pull it back and have the lawsuits and all that stuff. No, when people have control of the enterprises and profit's not the only motive, they're going to care about their communities. They're going to care about their companies. They're going to want them. They aren't going to want them to jeopardize the community and our people for profit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's why the ownership model, I think, has to change. We spread it out. We don't have to go at breakneck speed going forward, but you always want to be making forward steps. So if you're not sure about a technology and you're going to release it when you're not sure about it, I think when more of it is in the public domain, the workers themselves owning it, I think they're going to be much more cautious as they release it,
Mm-hmm.
because their children and their families are going to be impacted by it.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, they release something into the environment in Detroit. They could be sitting in a skyscraper in London or in New York. No impact on them or their families, right? So they're doing it because they want to maximize profit, get it to market sooner, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily fully tested, and so they release these things without. In terms of AI, you put that into the hands of very few people who control it, and they essentially have the power to dictate to everyone else. There's a huge power differential, right? But when you have the workers themselves owning these enterprises, and we control these technologies to benefit all of us. We're working cooperatively, collaboratively. We want AI to benefit us. We don't want it to harm us, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when profit is the motive, and it's the only motive, there's nothing in the corporate structure that says we got to worry about the health and well-being of a community. You might hear a few one-liners too in the front of their annual report, but what they're really looking at, and most of that annual report is all the numbers,
Mm-hmm.
is how do I return maximum invested to shareholders? It's by getting products to the market, killing the competition. That's not cooperative. That's not collaborative. And there's nothing in there about the health of the community, our children, our families,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, all of this ties together.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing we have to look at is the way we deliver public services that we have now. We know we have the technology to raise healthy, happy, productive human beings. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any. Some of the people are doing it, but there's a lot of people who are unable to do that for one reason or another, because they don't have good, secure jobs, maybe because they came from dysfunctional backgrounds themselves and they haven't been conditioned in a way. Maybe they don't know how to raise kids. Maybe they're young parents that have never really been trained or had any. So, we have to think about public services, mental health, dental health. All of these things come together in a way to support our children and our families. Once you start giving our children and our families the kind of supports they really need as human beings, they're going to develop in a way that's going to be healthy. They'll be happier. They'll be more productive. They'll work better with their neighbors. And that's the way everybody in society is going to benefit. That's what we want. We want an economic system that drives that, right? So over time, we're going to do a lot of transitioning, and we're going to utilize technology, but we need to make sure that we own that technology. It's not concentrated into a few guys' hands who have one motive in mind, and that's increasing profit for the shareholders, which mostly is them.
but I see that as a very daunting task. Because you look now at the tech companies, there seems to be a relationship between the tech companies and who controls the information and the tech. versus who has access to that. Like, does the benefit of do we get the benefit of the technology, or do the people, the technocrats, are they getting more of the benefit of it? I guess that would be my question. I'm thinking of the last time there was something that was major and technological where the people could really say that they benefited significantly from it. I mean,
Mhm.
I guess you could say that the computer was a really important um technological advancement for the people. But when you start talking about AI, to me, that seems like it's always going to be a very exclusive club. Um, for the reasons that I gave off camera, because I mean, you look at just a product like the iPhone, how many people, past 50 years old operate using that kind of technology the same? There's like a big drop off. I feel like it's very much geared towards younger people. And maybe I'm wrong about that because we all have to use technology some kind of way, but it has to do with that attachment that people have with the technology. I feel like AI is always going to be something that's sure is going to grow, but is it ever going to be is it going to reach a critical mass?
Well, I mean, over time, you're right. Different people, the younger people are quicker at adopting the technology and using it. And it's always been that way. Any new technology comes in, the young are the first to jump on it often. I don't think it's using it that is the issue. I think it's who owns it and controls it is the problem. So let's take the technology, the supercomputers, where these guys sit there in skyscrapers right close to Wall Street, so that the speed of the electrons going through the wire, it's a shorter wire, and they can get their trades executed a lot faster. Now, they own those supercomputers. They own that software. They own the physicists that design the algorithms and the programmers that design the algorithms that make sure they can profit on trillions and trillions of trades. And then compare that to the normal investor, even sitting out here with a sophisticated PC and a trading platform. How effective are you going to compete with that?
You can't.
You know that because he owns that he's going to have a huge benefit for him. Quite frankly, you put your money in the market in this kind of environment, for them, they just reach in. It's like taking candy from a baby.
Of course.
Anytime they want your money, they know exactly how to get it and they just extract it. And that's why we see this great wealth divide. Okay. So there are a lot of people who think somehow that the markets serve them and that Wall Street, and no, these investors are at a huge disadvantage. And it's amazing. Yeah, they could do better relative to some of their neighbors, right? But when you look at the total picture and the cost to overall society and the insane distribution of wealth that we have in our society today, you've got kids on the one hand that are not getting their basic nourishment. They're not getting the health care access they need. They're not getting the education they need. We have people living in cars, living in the streets in tents. You got homelessness and poverty at the one extreme. And then at the other extreme, you got people that have $150 billion. How the heck do you spend $150? What do you do with $150 billion? What do you do with that? Except to use it to even build more wealth, to make to expand those extremes, to spread that gap, even make it further. That's a destabilizing thing in every society. It always has been. And that's why, getting back to your question about Jubilee, why did they have Jubilees? Because it gets so unbalanced that the whole system's going to collapse. So the wealthy go, all right, let's reset the clock, give them back their money, and now they can spend again. And we'll get the wheels turning. Problem is now that even getting the wheels turning, when you get it turning, but it's not efficient, maybe it's not healthy for the environment, we have another big problem that we face. And that's the environmental problem. That's something that has changed. We've never had that before. So you could just make the economic system more efficient and spin it that way. That's not going to work anymore, because not only does it have to spin, it has to be clean. Otherwise, we threaten all of our healths are threatened. Everybody, right? And so the basic economic model that we have today isn't going to work well for most of our citizens. It's not going to work well for humanity. We share this planet, and we're going to have to learn to work together. When you have differences, You can't have conflict. You've got to talk. You've got to communicate. You've got to negotiate. You have to work together. You know, collaboration and cooperation always wins out. So instead of investing so much money in a military complex, maybe we need a diplomatic corps. Maybe we need a program where we have exchange students going from culture to culture, nation to nation, learning from each other. What are you doing? How's that working? You know, getting the best options, designing it so that it works for all of us. This is the kind of potential that we have. We just need the political leadership to take us there.
I have one final question for you. It's something that you said that made me generate this question. You gave a visual there between the haves and the have-nots. You gave a visual between the homelessness crisis that we have, and then on the other gradient, you have people who multi-billionaire class.
Well, those are the two extremes. Of course, in the middle, there's a large number of working poor too.
But that's what I'm going to get to. But even you can slice it even more in between. Then, if we're talking about the electoral potential of people out there, people who are considering voting for Jon Stasevich or anyone else, how do you reach out to that large scale that you just explained? Because we already know where one side of the gradient is going, but then you have another side of the extreme of the gradient that aren't even part of the political process anyway. So you're really talking about a limited number of people that you're having to reach, because the electoral system is like that, where we have the country that doesn't even participate.
Mhm.
So how do you feel like your message would resonate with the people who do participate, and what types of people are you trying to get and penetrate to consider your message? Like, what do you feel like your base is?
Well, I mean, I actually think I think that my message resonates with everyone. If I have the opportunity to sit down and talk with them and reach them, of course, I can't deliver this in a soundbite. You're not going to be able to understand where I'm coming from in a 2-minute soundbite, because it's the world is complex. And so the answers are complex, and the answers aren't black and white either. Again, there's many ways to solve a problem. What we want to understand are, what are the options, and we want to explore all the options, and we want to discuss it. We want to discuss it openly. We want to bring in people. We want to engage. We want the best minds. We want all these perspectives. We want to make our diversity our strength. Right now, people think diversity is a problem. No, it shouldn't be. I use the Hadron Collider in Geneva, Switzerland, as an example all the time. This is a scientific project. You've got thousands of scientists from hundreds of different countries, speaking dozens and dozens of different languages. And yet they come together, working together, and they build the most complex machine that humanity's ever built. And it gives them insight into the fundamental reality of our universe, how things actually work, right? That has allowed us to the quantum physics, what we've learned from that allows us to have all these technologies like GPS that get us where we need to go, right? So everything that we see in our life, the iPhones, the miniaturization, the electronic devices, the computer capacity, the software, all of that stuff is a result of what happens at that place. So that's how important cooperation and collaboration is. Now, my personal view, scientific research should not be privatized. What we learn about human nature, about nature, is something that should benefit all of us, not just a handful of owners of any particular corporation.
Okay. Is there any questions from the audience? Because if not, that's fine or whatever. I think we've had a great conversation, and I know we had a question initially. Is there any other engagement, Jason?
Not at this time. We had a maximum of like 4 concurrent viewers and total 11 views so far.
What was that?
11 views so far, and up to 4 concurrent.
Okay.
Okay.
But I was going to say to the people in the audience, I think that this was a great conversation with John, and this is kind of a more human perspective. I mean, I feel like our interviews before have been like that as well. There was just maybe I had a whole bunch of notes and stuff, but this was meant to be more of a conversation. But John Stasevich, independent candidate running for president of the United States 2024. He appreciates your support. Um, he's been on my platform 3 different times. Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum, and I encourage your audience to subscribe to me too, because we really try to highlight people like John and other candidates, and just to get alternative perspectives. John's message is really strong about bringing people together, unity, coalition building, working across different political ideologies, but more so focusing that your neighbor isn't your enemy. And I think that that's an important message to sort of conclude with, is that your neighbor is not your enemy, and that really to find any sort of unity, we may have to look outside of this two-party system and to consider candidates like John Stasevich. But we thank you for your attention and consideration, and have a great evening.
Thank you, Kiko.
I think it went well.